Every great love begins with a single moment. Tonight, I'll share a story that will touch your heart and surprise you. Subscribe now, so you'll always be the first to discover the next unforgettable journey. In the heart of New York City, where the skyline pierced the clouds and the streets never slept, there lived a man who seemed to have conquered the world. His name was Adrian Drake, a billionaire whose face appeared on the covers of financial magazines and whose every move influenced the markets. To the outside world, Adrian was the embodiment of success, tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying himself with the cold assurance of a man who answered to no one. But behind the glossy photographs and the glowing headlines was a man whose heart had grown quiet and empty. Adrian had built his empire in virtual reality entertainment, creating worlds of illusion so vivid that people forgot, even for a little while, the struggles of their real lives. Yet for all the millions of users, for all the wealth piled at his feet, Adrian himself had forgotten how to feel. He lived alone in a glass tower above the city, his office a fortress of steel and screens. Employees whispered his name in fear, for his temper was sharp and his patience short. To them, he was not a man, but a machine of ambition, demanding results and innovation without ever slowing down. At company meetings, executives praised him with hollow flattery, but none dared speak the truth that the heart of the company was slowly dying, that creativity had drained away, leaving only numbers and profits. Adrian knew it in his bones. Though he never admitted it, the empire he had built stood on shaky ground, and the louder the applause from outside, the deeper the silence grew within. Far below his tower, in a cramped corner of the very same company, another life unfolded. Mia Tran sat at her desk in the customer service department, answering endless calls from frustrated clients. To her coworkers, she was invisible. They barely remembered her name, referring to her as the temp or the girl in the corner. She dressed simply, spoke softly, and carried an air of quiet dignity that others mistook for weakness. Yet Mia carried a secret. One she told no one. She had once been a gifted pianist, a young woman with dreams of concert halls and audiences swept away by the power of her music. She had studied in Europe on scholarship, her fingers weaving magic across the ivory keys. But life, with its cruel hand, had overturned her future. When her father's business collapsed and her mother fell ill, Mia returned home. The piano was sold to pay hospital bills, and her days became a struggle to keep food on the table. Now, instead of playing sonatas under chandeliers, she listened to the hum of headsets and the irritation of clients. She endured the mocking glances of her colleagues, who considered her a failure. But in her heart, the music never died. Late at night, when the city quieted and loneliness wrapped around her, Mia borrowed the company's forgotten test software and recorded fragments of her composition's notes that carried both her sorrow and her hope, a melody of silence waiting to be heard. Adrian and Mia lived in the same building of glass and steel, yet in worlds that could not have been further apart. He, the feared master of the empire, with eyes that looked forward but never inward. She, the overlooked worker, carrying a treasure that no one valued. Neither knew that their paths were destined to cross, not through ambition or chance, but through the most unexpected of languages, music. For now, the stage was being set, as quietly and as inevitably as a storm forming beyond the horizon. Adrian, surrounded by numbers that no longer satisfied him, and Mia, clinging to music that no one else could hear, were about to find each other in a way that would change not only their lives, but the destiny of the company itself. And so the story begins, in the city that never sleeps, with a man who had everything but felt nothing, and a woman who had nothing but carried within her the power to heal. The storm came without warning, and it shook the empire Adrian Drake had built to its core. It began with a series of error messages that appeared across the company's flagship virtual reality system, glitches so small at first that they were brushed aside as technical noise. But within hours, Millions of users around the world began to experience crashes, freezes, and horrifying distortions in their immersive worlds. What was once a sanctuary of escape turned into a prison of broken images and sounds. Social media exploded in outrage. Customers demanded refunds, and investors began to whisper words Adrian hated most: failure, instability, collapse. Inside the tower that housed the company's headquarters, panic spread like fire. Executives rushed between conference rooms, voices trembling, screens flashing red with warnings. Engineers pounded on keyboards, sweat beading on their foreheads as they fought to locate the cause of the chaos. Adrian stood at the center of it all, his jaw tight, his eyes colder than the winter skyline outside. To the board of directors, he spoke with authority, promising solutions, demanding speed, commanding loyalty. But deep within, even he felt the tremor of fear. He knew, too, well, how fragile power could be. He had risen high enough to see how fast a fall could come. In the boardroom, men in suits argued loudly, their faces pale under the harsh lights. "We can't contain the fallout," one shouted. "Our biggest competitor will crush us by the end of the week if this continues." Another slammed his fist on the polished table. "Customers are threatening a class action lawsuit. This isn't just about money, it's about survival." Adrian listened in silence, his fingers steepled, his expression carved in stone. When he finally spoke, the room fell quiet. "Excuses will not save us. Innovation will. Find me a solution, or find yourselves replaced." His words cut sharper than any blade, and the men shifted uncomfortably, knowing he meant every syllable. Outside the boardroom, in the lower floors of the building, Mia Tran overheard fragments of the storm that raged above. Calls from angry customers poured in like a flood, their voices harsh and impatient. She sat at her desk, headset pressed against her ear, murmuring calm reassurances she barely believed. Around her, her coworkers panicked, gossiping about layoffs and bankruptcy. They rolled their eyes when Mia kept working diligently, whispering to one another that a girl like her had no chance of surviving the cuts that were surely coming. To them, she was invisible, but to Mia, each voice on the line mattered. She wrote notes, quietly observing the patterns in the complaints, sensing something deeper than a technical glitch. Back upstairs, Adrian retreated into his office after hours of fruitless meetings. He stood before the wall of glass that looked out over the city, its lights flickering like stars beneath his feet. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on his shoulders. For years he had been the man with answers, the genius with vision, the titan who never faltered. But now, his empire teetered, and the silence in his chest grew heavy. He pressed his hands against the cool glass and whispered to no one, "Not now. I won't let this end now." The night dragged on, and the company's situation worsened. News channels broadcast stories of users fainting from disorientation caused by the glitches. A rival corporation released a statement mocking Adrian's empire as a hollow spectacle. Stock prices plummeted. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting, threatening to pull out unless a miracle appeared. In the cafeteria, employees whispered about their resumes, already planning to abandon ship. Even the most loyal among them began to doubt whether Adrian Drake could save them this time. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, a small light flickered unnoticed. On one of the countless servers, tucked away in the labyrinth of code and data, rested a melody, recorded late at night by a woman who had nothing to her name but a memory of the piano she once loved. That file, unheard and forgotten, carried within it a kind of healing the company had never imagined. It was not a line of code nor a piece of software, but something deeper, something human, though Adrian did not yet know it. The solution to his empire's greatest crisis did not lie in the brilliance of engineers or the strategies of executives. It lay in the heart of someone no one saw, someone sitting far below in the building he ruled, quietly answering calls and holding on to her dignity. The fire of crisis had been lit. The empire trembled, and Adrian's grip on control loosened. But storms, as brutal as they are, also reveal hidden truths. Soon, Adrian and Mia's world so distant, so divided would be forced to collide. And when they did, the story of silence and music, of power and love, would begin its rise. The night was heavy with silence inside Adrian Drake's office, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and refuses to let go. His empire was cracking before his eyes, and every effort to mend it had only deepened the fractures. He sat before a bank of screens glowing with failure reports, the numbers flashing red like warning sirens. He had spent hours listening to his engineers argue, offering theories and excuses, but none had produced a cure for the chaos spreading through his company's virtual reality system. Exhaustion gnawed at him, though he refused to admit it. Adrian was not a man who surrendered, and yet, as the city lights twinkled beneath his tower, he wondered, for the first time in years, if perhaps he was standing on the edge of a defeat he could not stop. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, letting the hum of the servers fill the room. Somewhere deep in the labyrinth of data, a file opened itself on his screen not because he sought it, but because the system, in its desperate recalibrations, stumbled upon it. A strange, delicate sound drifted into the air. Adrian opened his eyes, startled. It was not an alarm, not a glitch, not static. It was music. The notes of a piano filled the room, soft and haunting, carrying with them a depth that pierced through the cold machinery surrounding him. Adrian froze, his breath caught in his throat. He had not listened to music for years. It had always seemed a distraction, an indulgence, something for weaker souls who needed comfort. But this melody was different. It seeped into the cracks of his mind, where no strategy or calculation could reach. For a moment, the noise of crisis fell away, and all he could hear was the quiet strength of those notes, rising and falling like a tide. He leaned closer to the screen, tracing the metadata of the file. It was unnamed, tucked away under a test folder. No official mark, no engineer signature. Just a string of numbers. Adrian frowned. How had this slipped into the system? He pressed play again, and the music returned, wrapping the sterile office in warmth. He felt something he had almost forgotten calm. But more than that, he noticed something strange. As he cross-checked the sound against error reports, he saw the metrics shift. Test users exposed to this file had shown reduced distress, lower complaint levels, even moments of unexpected engagement. This isn't code, Adrian muttered under his breath. This is something else. His mind raced. The engineers had been hunting for a technical fix, a patch, an algorithm to mask the failures. But here, hidden in plain sight, was a human solution music that soothed, steadied, even healed. He tapped his pen against the desk, sharp eyes narrowing. Someone in his company had created this. Someone had dared to insert something personal, something unapproved, into the system. Ordinarily, Adrian would have been furious at such insubordination. But tonight, as the melody played on, he felt something entirely different: curiosity. He played the file a third time, letting the piano whisper into the darkness. The music carried sadness, yes, but not despair. It carried hope pressed through hardship, a quiet resilience that spoke directly to the part of Adrian he had buried long ago. He thought of his childhood-off evenings when his mother played old records in their modest living room, before wealth and ambition had hardened him. He had not let himself remember those days in years. Now, with every note, they returned. Adrian stood abruptly, pacing the office. Who had done this? Which employee dared to place something so human into his empire of machines? He called up the system logs, tracing the file's path. His screen displayed a list of access points, obscure and irrelevant until one caught his eye. The origin came not from a senior developer, nor a research scientist, but from the basement level of the company, the floor reserved for customer service and entry-level staff. His brow furrowed. That floor was far removed from innovation, a place where complaints were answered and minor staff rotated in and out. Whoever had placed this file, there was not part of his inner circle. The thought unsettled him. Could it be a mistake? An accident? Or had someone quietly, defiantly, left a gift the company didn't know it needed? Adrian played the melody again, unwilling to let it go. He felt the faintest trace of admiration for the unknown hand that had written it. For years, he had believed the future would be built only with code, hardware, and money. But now, in his darkest hour, the thing that caught him before the fall was neither code nor cash. It was music. At that moment, Adrian made a decision. He would find the person behind this. Not tomorrow, not next week tonight. He pressed a button on his intercom, summoning his head of security. "Trace this file," he commanded, his voice low but firm. "I want to know who created it. Bring me their name." The guard, startled by the intensity in Adrian's eyes, nodded and left without a word. As the office grew silent once more, the melody continued to play, echoing against the walls of steel and glass. Adrian stood alone, listening, realizing that for the first time in a long time, he was not just fighting to save his company. He was searching for something deeper, something he could not yet name. Little did he know that the music belonged to Mia Tran, the quiet woman in the corner whom no one noticed, the one who carried in her heart the power to change not only a company, but the very life of a man who believed he was beyond redemption. And so, with the soft notes of a piano leading the way, the path of discovery began. The following morning, the storm of crisis still raged, but Adrian Drake had only one thought on his mind: the music. He had spent the night listening to that piano piece over and over, letting it carry him through the darkness like a lantern in a cavern. It haunted him in ways he could not explain. By dawn, his security chief returned with the name he demanded. Adrian's sharp eyes scanned the paper, and for a moment he thought it was a mistake. The file traced back to a woman he had never once noticed in his empire. Mia Tran, customer service, temporary contract, a woman so far beneath the levels of power that she might as well have been invisible. Adrian felt a flash of irritation. How could a temp, a mere receptionist of complaints, create something that slipped into his system and altered its data? He should have been furious. Normally, he would have fired the person immediately for bypassing protocol. But instead, he found himself pacing his office with restless energy, curiosity gnawing at him like hunger. Who was this woman, and how had she done it? He summoned his assistant with a curt order: "Bring her to me." Now, down on the lower floors, Mia was at her desk, headset snug against her ear, softly reassuring a furious client whose VR headset had glitched into chaos. She had grown used to absorbing anger like a sponge, keeping her voice calm even when insults rained upon her. Her coworkers barely looked up as the suited assistant strode into the room, scanning faces until his eyes fell on her. "Mia Tran?" he asked sharply. She nodded cautiously, her soft brown eyes wide with confusion. "Mr. Drake wants to see you." Immediately, a murmur ran through the office. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. No one from customer service was ever summoned to the top floor, let alone by Adrian Drake himself. The elevator ride felt endless. Mia clutched her small notebook to her chest, her heart pounding. She had never seen the CEO in person. He was a legend, a figure from news screens and headlines, never from her world of cubicles and ringing phones. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a space that felt like another universe: glass walls that framed the city like a painting, marble floors that gleamed under the morning sun. Silence, so heavy she could hear the faint hum of the servers behind the walls. Adrian was waiting at the far end of the office, standing tall in a suit of deep charcoal, his presence as commanding as a storm cloud. His eyes locked on her the moment she entered. For a long breath, he said nothing, only studied her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floor. Then, his voice broke the silence, sharp yet controlled. "You're Mia Tran?" "Yes," she answered softly, clutching her notebook tighter. "You placed a file in my system." His tone carried accusation, but beneath it was something else: curiosity, a tension she could not name. Mia swallowed. "It was just music, something I recorded after hours. I didn't think anyone would ever notice." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Do you understand the risk you took? Unauthorized files compromise security. Entire systems can collapse because of recklessness." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady. "I'm sorry if I broke the rules, but I wasn't trying to harm the system. I needed somewhere to put the music. It's all I have left." That last sentence pierced through him. Adrian tilted his head slightly, watching her. There was no arrogance in her tone, no defiance, just quiet truth. He gestured toward his desk. "Play it." Mia blinked, startled. "Play now." "Yes." "The piano piece." "Sit there." He pointed to the sleek digital keyboard in the corner of his office, an ornament he had never touched. Hesitantly, Mia walked across the room, her footsteps echoing. She sat at the instrument, placed her trembling hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. Then, slowly, she began to play. The same melody filled the air, this time not through a recording, but alive, flowing from her fingertips. The notes rose like fragile wings, carrying warmth into the cold chamber of glass and steel. Adrian stood motionless, listening. For the first time in years, he felt the walls around his heart shift. The music was not perfect, it carried hesitations, breaths of sorrow, but within those imperfections lay something raw, something real. He could see her, truly see her, not as a temp or an employee, but as a woman whose spirit had survived loss and still found the strength to create beauty. When the last note faded, silence fell again, but it was no longer empty. Adrian's voice, lower now, almost reverent, broke it. "Why did you do this?" Mia looked at him, her expression soft yet firm. "Because people need more than entertainment. They need to feel something real. And sometimes, music can reach places technology never can." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. He had built his life on numbers, code, and dominance. Yet here stood a woman from the lowest rung of his company daring to tell him the truth he had buried for years. He should have dismissed her, sent her back downstairs, erased the file. Instead, Adrian found himself saying, "You will stay. You will help me fix this." Mia's breath caught, disbelief flickering across her face. She nodded slowly, her hands still resting on the keys. In that moment, something shifted in the room, something neither of them fully understood. The billionaire who had never needed anyone had just reached out, and the overlooked woman who had never been seen had finally been recognized. It was not love yet, not even trust, but it was the first step on a path neither had expected to walk. And as the city hummed beyond the glass, the world outside still raging in crisis, Adrian Drake and Mia Tran stood at the edge of a meeting that would change both their lives forever. The news of Mia Tran's unexpected appearance in Adrian Drake's inner circle spread through the company like wildfire. By the afternoon of her first day in the top-floor conference room, whispers had turned to open resentment. Executives who had clawed their way up through years of loyalty and ambition now found themselves sitting beside a woman they had always overlooked, a woman who, in their eyes, had no right to be there. When Adrian introduced her, their polite smiles were masks stretched over disbelief. Some hid their contempt behind clipped nods, others did not bother to hide it all. To them, Mia was nothing more than an intruder. She felt it in every glance that cut across the table. Her presence was a disruption, a thorn in their pride. The chief technical officer leaned back in his chair, smirking. "With all respect, Miss Drake, customer service isn't exactly where innovation is born. Are we really turning to music to solve this?" His words dripped with disdain. A few others chuckled, the sound sharp and cruel in the sterile air of the boardroom. Mia lowered her gaze, clutching her notebook, her hands trembling slightly. Adrian's voice sliced through the noise, calm but edged with iron. "We are turning to results. And unless you have produced something better, you will listen." The laughter stopped instantly, but the hostility remained, seething beneath the surface. Adrian's defense gave Mia a flicker of courage, but also painted a target on her back. From that moment on, she knew the others would not forgive her so easily. Over the following days, the tension only grew. Mia worked tirelessly, pouring her heart into developing a program that could integrate her music with the company's VR system. She stayed late into the night, her delicate fingers sketching ideas across pages, her eyes burning from the glow of the screen. But each time she presented her thoughts, the executives tore into them with ridicule. "This isn't science, it's sentiment," one scoffed. Do you really think a melody can fix what millions of dollars of engineering couldn't? Another sneered. Mia endured the humiliation with quiet grace, though inside her chest the words burned. She wanted to leave, to escape the constant scorn, but each time she thought of walking away, she remembered her mother's tired smile, the bills piled high on the kitchen counter, and the fire inside her that refused to die. She had sacrificed too much already to let their cruelty silence her now. Adrian watched these battles from his seat at the head of the table. He rarely spoke in her defense, not because he did not care, but because he wanted to see if she would break. He had spent his life surrounded by men and women who told him only what he wanted to hear. But Mia, this quiet, unlikely woman, had dared to place her truth into his empire without fear of consequence. He needed to know if she had the strength to stand against the storm, as he had. And so, even as the executives sharpened their knives with words, Adrian's sharp eyes never left her, studying, measuring, silently willing her to fight. One night, after another grueling session, Mia sat alone in the empty boardroom, her shoulders slumped, her hands pressed against her face. The city stretched beyond the glass, glittering, indifferent to her struggle. She whispered to herself, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here." The sound of footsteps pulled her from her despair. Adrian entered quietly, his presence filling the room, even without a word. He stopped beside her, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the skyline. "They despise you," he said bluntly. Mia flinched, then nodded, unable to deny it. "Yes," she whispered. Adrian turned to her, his gaze piercing. "But they despise you because you threaten them. Power hates what it cannot control. Remember that." His words were not gentle, but they carried a strange kind of strength, like steel laid across her shoulders. Mia lifted her head, meeting his eyes. "And what about you? Do you despise me too?" For a moment, something flickered in his expression, something softer than his usual mask. "No," he said quietly. "I admire you." Those words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For Mia, it was the first time someone of his stature had acknowledged her worth. For Adrian, it was the first time he had spoken admiration aloud in years. Neither said more. Instead, silence wrapped around them, not the cold silence of loneliness, but the fragile kind that comes before something new begins. Still, the road ahead was treacherous. The executives would continue their war, whispering behind closed doors, plotting her failure. And Mia would have to endure every test, every humiliation, every challenge that came with daring to step into a world that had never welcomed her. But Adrian's words lit a spark in her heart, one she carried back down to her modest apartment that night, where she sat at her old notebook and scribbled new lines of music. The melody was no longer just sorrow. It carried fight. Thus, the battle lines were drawn. In the empire of glass and steel, where power had always belonged to the ruthless, a quiet woman from the margins had begun to carve her place. And though she did not yet know it, her strength would one day shake the walls of Adrian Drake's world in ways none of his rivals could ever imagine. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering the glass walls of Adrian Drake's penthouse like 1,000 impatient drums. The city glowed beneath the storm, neon lights blurring into rivers of color. But up above, the world felt quiet, almost suspended in time. Adrian had summoned Mia Tran to his private home, a place no employee had ever been invited before. The invitation itself felt like a command there was no refusing him. Yet for Mia, walking into his towering fortress of steel and glass, the moment felt surreal. She had never been in such a place, marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, walls of art worth more than her family's entire lifetime of earnings, and windows so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. Adrian waited for her in the center of the great room, his silhouette framed by the storm outside. He was still in his suit, but his tie hung loose, his shirt slightly undonian image of power stripped bare, if only slightly. His eyes followed her as she entered, cautious, her small umbrella dripping water onto the polished floor. "You're late," he said, though his voice lacked the usual sharpness. "The trains were delayed," Mia replied softly, setting her umbrella aside. He studied her for a long moment, then motioned toward the grand piano that sat untouched in the corner. Its black surface gleamed under the dim light, an ornament of wealth he had never cared to use. "Play," he ordered simply. Mia hesitated, her heart pounding. "Here? Now?" "Yes. I want to hear it again. Not through a recording. I want to feel it." His tone carried no room for argument, but there was something in his eyes, something restless, almost pleading. She crossed the room slowly, her steps echoing in the vast space, and sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, then pressed down. The melody began, the same one she had hidden in the company's system, but alive now, pulsing in the air like a heartbeat. The notes floated above the storm, weaving sorrow and hope into a tapestry of sound. Adrian stood behind her, listening, his chest rising and falling as memories stirred within him. The music unlocked a part of him he had long buried, evenings from his youth when his mother, long gone now, had filled their modest home with old records. For years he had drowned those memories beneath ambition, but now they returned with force, each note breaking cracks in the armor he had built around his heart. When the last chord faded, silence hung heavy between them. Adrian exhaled slowly, then spoke in a voice softer than Mia had ever heard. "You remind me of something I lost a long time ago." Mia turned to look at him, her eyes wide, uncertain. "Music isn't something you lose," she said gently. "It waits. It waits until you're ready to listen again." The words lingered in the air, touching something raw in him. He walked to the window, his reflection merging with the storm beyond. "You don't understand what it means to lose everything," he said, his voice low. Mia rose from the bench and stepped closer, her own heart trembling with the courage it took to answer him. "I do," she whispered. "I lost my father's business, my mother's health, my future as a musician. But the music never left me. It saved me when nothing else could." Adrian turned then, his eyes locking onto hers. In that instant, the distance between billionaire and employee seemed to dissolve, replaced by two souls who had both carried loss, both fought through silence. He reached for her hand, almost without thinking, his fingers brushing hers with a touch surprisingly tender. For a man known for his coldness, the contact was startling, fragile. Mia did not pull away. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing across the skyline. But inside the penthouse, the world felt still. They stood there, hand to hand, saying nothing more. There was no declaration of love, no promises, only the simple, unspoken truth that something had shifted, something neither could deny. Adrian released her hand after a moment, his face once again composed, though his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. "Stay," he said quietly. "Work with me. Help me save this company." Mia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will." That night, as she left his home and stepped back into the rain, Mia felt both terrified and exhilarated. She knew the challenges ahead would be brutal, that the executives would sharpen their knives even further, that the world would resist her place by Adrian's side. But she also knew something else, that behind Adrian's steel exterior was a man who had finally begun to feel it. And somewhere deep inside, she believed her music had unlocked more than a path to save the company. It had unlocked a path between their hearts. As Adrian watched her disappear into the storm, he placed his hand against the glass once more. For years, he had stood in this tower alone, surrounded by silence. But now, for the first time, he could still hear the echo of a piano playing. It filled the emptiness with something he thought he would never find again: hope. The storm that had been brewing within the company finally broke wide open. Within a week, news networks filled their headlines with words: Adrian Drake, despised, collapse, failure, scandal. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings, their voices trembling with anger. Rival corporations circled like vultures, releasing polished statements mocking the downfall of Adrian's empire. In the streets, protesters gathered outside the company's headquarters, waving signs that read "Refund now" and "Drake lied, dreams died." What had once been a symbol of innovation was now a crumbling tower of doubt. In the boardroom, the pressure reached its boiling point. Adrian stood at the head of the long table, flanked by executives who wore panic on their faces. The chief financial officer's voice cracked as he slammed his papers down. "We're hemorrhaging money by the hour. If we don't deliver a fix, we'll lose everything: our market share, our investors, our future." Another director leaned forward, his voice sharp. "We have to pivot. Shut down the system. Cut losses. Abandon this sinking ship before it takes us all with it." The room buzzed with chaos, voices colliding, fear thick as smoke. But Adrian's face remained unreadable, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed their words. Then he stood straighter, his voice cutting across the storm like a blade. "No, we don't run. We rebuild." Silence fell, the executives staring at him in disbelief. He continued, his tone heavy with conviction. "We will launch again, stronger than before. And we will do it by integrating something this company has long forgotten: something real." His gaze shifted across the table until it landed on Mia, seated at the far end. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, the disbelief palpable. The CTO barked a laugh. "This again? With all respect, Mr. Drake, you're putting the fate of this company in the hands of a temp from customer service? This is madness." Adrian's eyes turned to steel. "It's vision, and it's the only way forward. If you don't like it, the door is behind you." The threat hung heavy in the air, daring anyone to challenge him. No one moved, though their anger seethed beneath their silence. Mia's heart pounded as all eyes turned to her. She wanted to shrink into her chair, to vanish from the weight of their scrutiny. But Adrian's words echoed in her mind: "Power hates what it cannot control." Gathering her courage, she lifted her chin. "I believe music can stabilize the system, not by masking the flaws, but by creating emotional anchors for the users. If they feel connected, they won't abandon us." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled under the table. Murmurs rippled through the room, executives scoffing, but Adrian cut them off. "You have 2 weeks. Deliver me results, or prepare for the consequences." That night, the company buzzed like a beehive shaken from its nest. Engineers worked round the clock, some reluctantly, others driven by fear. Yet through it all, Mia was at the center, guiding the project with a quiet determination no one could have predicted. She sketched ideas late into the night, worked with developers to thread her melodies into the code, and stood her ground when doubters tried to dismiss her. The more they resisted, the harder she pushed, and slowly, grudgingly, even the skeptics began to see results. The glitches diminished, the system stabilized, and test users reported feelings of calm they had never experienced before. Still, the tension grew sharper as the deadline approached. Shareholders threatened to pull out unless the relaunch proved flawless. Adrian knew that if they failed, not only would the company collapse, but his reputation, his very name, would be reduced to ashes. He carried that weight on his shoulders. Yet in his private moments, he found himself thinking less about his empire and more about Mia. He watched the way she worked, her quiet resilience, the way her music seemed to breathe life into lifeless machines. And though he rarely allowed himself such thoughts, he wondered if she was not only saving his company, but saving something within him he thought long gone. On the final night before the relaunch, the office glowed with sleepless energy. Mia sat at the piano in the lobby, playing softly for the exhausted team, her notes drifting through the building like a balm. Adrian stood on the balcony above, listening, his heart heavy with both fear and hope. Tomorrow, the world would judge them. Tomorrow, everything they had built or rebuilt would either soar or shatter. As the music swelled, Adrian clenched his fists, whispering to himself, "This has to work. It must." And deep inside, though he would not admit it, he knew he was not speaking only of the company. He was speaking of her, of the bond forming between them, fragile but undeniable. The storm outside the company had reached its peak. But inside, amid doubt and resistance, a different kind of storm was gathering, one of courage, defiance, and unexpected love. The stage was set for the greatest gamble of Adrian Drake's life, and Mia Tran stood at the very heart of it. The day before the relaunch dawned gray and heavy. the kind of sky that seemed to carry the weight of bad omens. Inside Adrian Drake's empire, tension hung in every corridor. The executives moved like restless shadows. Investors barked demands over constant phone calls, and the employees labored under the crushing fear that tomorrow could mean the end of everything. And in the middle of that storm, the betrayal came. Adrian discovered it late in the evening, when a confidential report crossed his desk. A trusted member of his inner circle, someone who had dined at his table, shared his victories, had leaked their secret project to a rival corporation. Screens blared the news. Within hours, their competitor would soon launch a system eerily similar to Adrian's new design, undermining all the progress his team had made. Rage boiled in his chest as he clenched the paper in his fist, his sharp jaw set in grim silence. For a man who had built his empire on loyalty, the sting of treachery cut deeper than any market loss. But as Adrian faced this blow, Mia faced one of her own. Down on the testing floor, she was suddenly surrounded by accusations. A group of executives stormed in, their voices harsh, their eyes filled with suspicion. "She's the weak link," one of them sneered. "She put her file in the system without authorization before Watts to stop her from doing it again. How do we know she didn't sell us out this time?" Another jabbed a finger at her trembling notebook. "A girl from customer service suddenly holding the keys to our future? It never made sense. Maybe it's because she had help from our competitors." Mia's face drained of color. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but the room erupted with overlapping voices. Words like spy, thief, liar filled the air. Her chest tightened, her throat closed. The humiliation was worse than any insult she had endured before. And when security was called to escort her out, the betrayal stung more than she could bear. She had given every piece of herself to the project, poured her heart into her music, only to be cast aside as if she were nothing. That night, as the city lights flickered below, Adrian sat alone in his office, the betrayal of his colleague heavy on his mind. But then, through the quiet, he noticed something missing. He hadn't seen Mia since the morning. He pressed a button, calling his assistant, only to hear the words that made his blood run cold. "She's gone." She was dismissed by the board. They accused her of leaking data. Adrian froze. He felt a surge of fury unlike anything he had known, directed not at Mia, but at those who had dared to touch her. For weeks he had tested her, measured her, doubted her, but through it all he had seen her truth. She was not a traitor. She was the one honest thing in his collapsing world. He stood abruptly, his reflection sharp in the glass wall before him. For the first time in years, Adrian Drake, the man who trusted no one, felt fear. Fear of losing her. Meanwhile, Mia walked through the rain-slicked streets, clutching her small bag against her chest. She had nowhere to go but home, a modest apartment where her mother's labored breathing filled the silence. She sat by the window, staring at the city, her heart breaking. "Maybe they were right," she whispered to herself. "Maybe I don't belong in their world." She opened her notebook, her tears smudging the ink of half-finished compositions. Music had always been her refuge, but tonight even the notes felt hollow. For the first time, she wondered if the world would be better without her dreams. But across town, Adrian listened once more to the file she had left behind in the system. The piano notes drifted through his office, soft and haunting, carrying both sorrow and resilience. And as they filled the space, Adrian realized a truth that struck him harder than any financial loss. Mia had saved his company not with code or strategy, but with her heart. And now, that same heart was out there in the world, broken by the cruelty of those who couldn't see her worth. He slammed his hand against the desk, his voice sharp as steel. No more. The next morning, he would face the shareholders, the press, the world itself. But tonight, he made a vow. He would find Mia. He would bring her back, and he would stand before his empire, not with another lie of power, but with the truth of who had truly saved them. The crisis had reached its peak. Adrian stood at the edge of ruin, betrayed by his closest allies, stripped of his certainty. Mia sat in her tiny apartment, questioning her very place in the world. They were both broken, both tested, both standing in the quiet before the storm of tomorrow. And though neither could see it yet, the music they had shared was not finished. Its melody still lingered in the night, waiting to rise again, to bind them together when all else had fallen apart. The morning of the relaunch dawned cold and bright, the kind of day when the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Cameras crowded the steps of Adrian Drake's headquarters, reporters jostling for position, their microphones poised to capture the fall of a man once untouchable. Inside the building, the board of directors gathered with grim faces, whispering about failure, bankruptcy, and the end of an empire. Investors waited with folded arms, ready to abandon ship at the first sign of weakness. Everyone expected Adrian to stand alone, delivering excuses and desperate promises. No one expected what came instead. Adrian entered the stage in his signature dark suit, his stride steady, his expression unreadable. The room hushed as he approached the podium, the glare of cameras flashing like lightning across his sharp features. He placed both hands firmly on the stand, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of command. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "for weeks you have been told this company is failing, that we have no future, that our vision has collapsed." He paused, letting the tension settle. "But today, I will show you the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Behind him, the massive screen lit up, not with graphs or code, but with a simple image of a piano resting in a beam of light. Adrian's voice deepened. "The truth is that this company was not saved by its algorithms. It was not saved by me. It was saved by something far more powerful, something most of us forgot long ago. Humanity, emotion, music." Gasps rose, the crowd shifting uneasily. "And it was saved," Adrian continued, his eyes fierce, "by a woman you all ignored. A woman dismissed, insulted, cast aside. Yet she carried within her the gift that none of us could create." He stepped aside, and into the light walked Mia Tran. The audience erupted with shock, board members whispering furiously, reporters scribbling notes. She stood small against the sea of faces, her hands trembling as she approached the piano waiting on stage. Adrian's voice rang out once more. "This is Mia Tran, and she is the reason we still stand today." Mia sat at the piano, her heart pounding louder than the storm of cameras. For a moment she froze, the memory of betrayal weighing heavy. But then she felt Adrian's presence behind her, steady as a shadow, and she drew in a deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys, and the melody began. The notes rose gently at first, a river of sound washing over the restless crowd. Then they grew stronger, weaving sorrow into hope, loss into renewal. Reporters lowered their pens, investors leaned forward, employees in the back wiped tears from their eyes. The music filled the hall with something words could not carry. It was not just a song, it was a promise that even in brokenness, beauty could rise. As the final chord echoed, silence gripped the room, deeper than before. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, like a wave breaking, the hall erupted in applause. Cameras flashed wildly, voices shouted, investors surged with renewed confidence. The board members, once filled with disdain, sat stunned, unable to deny what they had just witnessed. Adrian stepped forward, lifting his hand for quiet, his eyes burning with conviction. "This is our future," he declared. "Technology that heals. Innovation that does not strip us of our humanity, but restores it. And it will be led, from this day forward, by Mia Tran." His words rang like thunder, shattering the old order of the company. In that moment, every doubt, every sneer, every whisper against her crumbled into silence. Mia rose slowly, overwhelmed, her eyes glistening as the applause washed over her. She turned toward Adrian, uncertain what to say, but he stepped close, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You saved me," he said. "Not just the company. Me." Her breath caught, tears threatening to fall. "I only gave what I had left," she whispered. Adrian took her hand in front of the world, his mask of steel finally breaking. For the first time, the man who had never shown weakness revealed his heart. "Mia," he said, his voice steady, "I don't want to stand on this stage alone anymore. I want you beside Minute just here, not just today, but always. The crowd gasped, the applause faltered, then roared louder than before. Flashbulbs exploded like stars as Adrian Drake, the untouchable billionaire, stood hand in hand with a woman no one had respected and declared not only her genius, but his love. Mia's tears fell freely now, but her smile was radiant. She squeezed his hand, whispering through her trembling lips, "Then I will stay." The hall shook with applause, not just for the survival of a company, but for the birth of something rare: truth, courage, and love standing side by side. Adrian and Mia faced the crowd together, the melody of her music still lingering in the air, stronger than any storm. And for the first time in his life, Adrian felt not the weight of power, but the lift of hope he would never again have to face the silence alone. The days that followed the relaunch were unlike anything Adrian Drake's empire had ever seen. The system that had once faltered now thrived, infused with Mia Tran's music. Reports poured in from around the world. Users spoke not just of entertainment, but of healing, of finding calm in the storms of their own lives. The company's value soared higher than ever, stock prices rebounding with a vengeance, investors clamoring to praise the man they had nearly abandoned. Yet when reporters asked Adrian for comment, he always gave the same answer: the credit belongs to Mia. For a man who had once lived on ego, it was a statement that shocked them all. Inside the headquarters, things changed slowly but surely. The executives who had mocked Mia now lowered their voices in her presence, their pride stripped by Adrian's public declaration. Employees who once ignored her now sought her guidance, eager to learn from her vision. And though whispers of jealousy still lingered, no one dared challenge her authority. Adrian had made it clear Mia was not just part of his company, she was the heart of its future. Yet beyond the business, something deeper was unfolding. Adrian, once a man of steel and solitude, found himself lingering in the spaces where Mia worked. He would watch her sketch notes, test melodies, hum softly under her breath, and he realized he had built an empire of walls around himself only to see her break through them with music. He no longer measured his days in profits or losses, but in moments like the sound of her laughter echoing through the halls, or the quiet evenings when they spoke of life beyond the empire. One evening, long after the offices had emptied, Adrian stood with Mia in the great atrium. The city glittered outside, a sea of light stretching endlessly. He turned to her, his voice quieter than the hum of the night. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked. She tilted her head, her dark eyes curious. "I saved your company," she teased softly. He shook his head. "You saved me from myself. I built a world of machines, but you reminded me I was still human." His hand brushed hers, tentative but sure. "I don't want to forget that again." Mia's smile was gentle, her words tender. "Then don't. Music doesn't leave. It waits for us to return." Their bond deepened, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet certainty of two souls who had walked through storms and found each other on the other side. For Adrian, love was no longer an indulgence, but a lifeline. For Mia, respect was no longer something she fought for alone, but something given freely, finally, by the man who had once seemed untouchable. In time, Adrian established a new division in the company dedicated entirely to therapeutic innovation programs that blended art with technology to heal, to soothe, to give hope. And he placed Mia at its head, not as a token of affection, but as the leader she had proven herself to be. Shareholders cheered the profits, but employees whispered of something greater that their empire had gained a soul. On a quiet Sunday evening, away from the glare of the world, Adrian and Mia sat together in his penthouse. The storm of weeks past was a memory now, replaced by the warm glow of lamps and the soft resonance of a piano. Mia's fingers danced across the keys, filling the air with a melody no one else would ever hear. Adrian stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes closed as he let the music wash over him. When the song ended, he spoke into the silence, his words steady. "I used to believe success was about standing alone, but now I know it's about finding someone who makes standing together worth everything." Mia looked up at him, her smile illuminated by the golden light. and I used to think music was my only companion. But now it's more than that. It's what brought us here. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet revolution happening within the glass tower above. For the world, Adrian Drake remained the billionaire genius who had saved his empire. But for him, the true story was simpler. He had found love, and in that love, he had found himself again. And so, the story closed not with the clamor of applause or the roar of markets, but with the gentle sound of piano keys echoing into the night. Adrian and Mia sat together, not as CEO and employee, not as power and subordinate, but as two souls who had discovered that even in a world built on steel and ambition, the most powerful empire of all was one built on music